America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am HR McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on Europe. Our guest is European Parliament Secretary General Klaus Welle. The Parliament's Bureau appointed Mr. Welle as Secretary General in 2009. Prior to heading the Parliament's administration as Secretary General, Mr. Welle held numerous positions within the Parliament, including Head of the Cabinet of the President and Director General of Internal Policies. He previously led the European and Foreign Policy Department for the Christian Democratic Union of Germany and is a veteran of the German Air Force. Mr. Welle holds a degree in economics from the University of Witten Herdecke in Germany. The origins of the European Parliament date to the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1951. The treaty, which entered into force in 1952, joined Belgium, France, Italy, the Federal Republic of Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands as the European Coal and Steel Community, or ECSC. Members from each nation were elected by national parliaments to represent member states' interests in discussion at a common assembly. The ECSC's main purpose was, as stated by the Schuman Declaration, to eliminate the age-old opposition of France and Germany in order to give rise to cooperation and peace among European countries. It was the origin of all European Union institutions. In the following decades, over 10 ratified treaties evolved the Common Assembly into the European Parliament. The Parliament is one of the European Union's 7 main institutions, including the European Council, the Council of the European Union, or the Council, the European Commission, the Court of Justice of the European Union, and the European Central Bank. Today, the European Parliament is the only directly elected European Union institution. The over 700 members of the Parliament are elected every 5 years by universal suffrage. The Parliament works alongside the Council to adopt and amend legislation and set the EU budget. The Parliament also examines EU institutions and promotes democratic decision-making and human rights in Europe and around the globe. The European Union is the primary political and economic union that joins European nations to each other, while the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is the security alliance that ties the United States and Canada to 28 nations in Europe and Western Asia. The EU and NATO have 21 members in common, but the overlap may grow as Finland and Sweden consider joining NATO in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We welcome Secretary General Welle today to discuss the European Parliament's role in governing Europe, its priorities in response to the security and humanitarian crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the future of transatlantic cooperation.
Secretary General Klaus Welle, welcome to Battlegrounds. It's wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great pleasure on my side.
Well, I think we have a lot to talk about, so we should dive right in, I imagine. As we witness this brutal invasion of Ukraine and the humanitarian catastrophe that the EU is so involved in terms of trying to mitigate the humanitarian catastrophe. I think it's really brought to light the European Union's role in geopolitical competitions that are important to security and prosperity. And I thought I might just ask you a general question and then apply it to Ukraine about how you view the EU's role in geopolitical competitions and how you've seen it evolve as Secretary General.
Mm-hmm. I think this crisis has brought to light that when it's really tough, the member states are all rallying around the European Union. So the European Union is the place where they're all coming together. And even though in some policy areas in foreign affairs, we are still based on anonymity, on unanimous decision, we did show that the 27 could agree, and they could agree on quite serious measures on Russia. For example, the most severe sanction package that has ever been passed on any country around the world, which violated the global order. We are just about to completely revise our energy policy. There is already a decision which is a ban on coal from Russia, and we are very, very close, probably a week away or two maybe, for a very similar decision on Russian oil. But also the solidarity shown in this situation was something an individual country would not have been able to do. So millions of Ukrainian people, mostly women, children, and elderly, have been welcomed in the European Union under very special condition, which means they can work right away, they get support right away, they get healthcare right away. That wouldn't have been possible without that. And if individual countries then are put under pressure, like we've seen yesterday with Poland and Bulgaria, which are cut off now from Russian gas, solidarity is kicking in right away.
Klaus, I think it has been impressive. I think it's quite clear that Vladimir Putin was wrong in many of his assumptions. He expected, I think, first and foremost, disunity within European countries, disunity within the EU, and disunity in the transatlantic relationship. I wondered if you might also comment about the transatlantic dimension of the relationship between the EU and the United States in particular, and how you've seen that evolve during this crisis.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Probably what happened to Afghanistan was seen as an encouragement for action. And probably also some of the issues we've been having, including Brexit, has been seen as an encouragement that now we are weak. But in fact, the opposite has happened. The interchange between the European Union, and now I mean the European Union and its institutions, not just the individual member states, but really the European institutions and the US administration, is now happening on a daily basis, sometimes several times a day. I know from my colleagues in the other institutions that they sometimes have the impression that now the connection might be even stronger between Brussels and Washington than between Brussels and some of its member states. So we really can't complain. That's perfect. And it's showing that the transatlantic community is not only there, it's alive and it's thriving. And it's the only thing that protects us in these kind of crises.
Klaus, thank you. I think that, of course, Russia is going to continue to try to divide, as they have made this attempt recently by cutting off hydrocarbon exports to Bulgaria and Poland. It's encouraging to hear you say, though, that the European Union is going to make a decision on Russian hydrocarbon imports in the next week or two. I wonder if you might also comment on the relationship between the EU and NATO. Of course, the threat from Russia, or what we might call Mr. Putin's playbook, includes not only military aggression, but also cyber threats and cyber-enabled information warfare, a sustained campaign of political subversion across the continent, and of course, the use of an international criminal enterprise. And NATO is a political and military organization, but it's focused on the military dimension, the military arena. Do you foresee closer coordination with NATO on the horizon? And what are the EU's and your priorities in improving that coordination to cope, in particular, with what some people call Russian new generation warfare?
I think your question is very timely, because just this morning, we had the leaders of the different political groups in the European Parliament, so the different parties we are having, our case 7, not 2, which is not necessarily making things more complicated. Sometimes it's less complicated. But they had a meeting, and I've been participating in that together with the president, with Secretary General Stoltenberg. So they had a debate more than 1 hour on the current conflict. And there was anonymity in the strategic evaluation across all political groups, from left to right. And the unity could not be stronger. And the Secretary General said also very clearly, let's not forget that more than 90% of the citizens of the European Union are coming from NATO countries. And if we are looking at what decisions might be taken relatively soon, not for us to speculate, but in Finland and in Sweden, that figure can only go up. So de facto, we are extremely close. And I would also argue we are complementary. I know that in the experts debate, there is now a debate under the heading of the weaponization of everything. So it's not just traditional warfare with military equipment, but in order to go through such a struggle, you also need to be able to use all the other tools that might be needed in this, starting from sanctions, let's say creating your own economic independence. Technology is crucial. And the European Union right now has already passed 5 sanction packages very comprehensively on Russia. And the 6th one is in preparation. For example, there is no overflight rights anymore for Russian ships. For Russian airplanes, Russian ships are not allowed to land to arrive in European ports. Technology, which might be crucial for the exploitation of gas and oil in Russia, is banned. Not speaking about the huge measure putting 300 billion of the Russian central bank into the reserve, which was basically the war chest, which was prepared for these kind of situations. So in fact, NATO is very, very strong on the military side, where we are not, but we are getting better. We are providing 1.5 billion already in weapons deliveries to Ukraine from a European Union fund. Who would have thought that a couple of years ago? We are doing a lot of research now in the area of defense, and there's a lot of the coordination on who is delivering which kind of weapons happening through European Union channels, even though that might not be so visible. So in fact, in times of weaponization of everything, NATO is very strong on the hardware side, but the European Union has the tools on sanctions, on energy diversification, which over the midterm is going to weaken Russia in a very fundamental way. So in fact, we are full partners. We are working very, very closely. There is no competition. We are complementary institutions which are working hand in hand.
Klaus, I'm so glad to hear you say that. I really think the integration of all elements of power are essential to promote peace and restore peace, essentially now, and promote prosperity. And it's clear, I think, from this conflict that economic security is directly connected to national security. And I wonder if you might talk about really how the EU is thinking about longer-term economic policies, particularly in the energy sector. I think it's quite clear now that giving Russia coercive power over Europe's economy by overdependence on Russian hydrocarbons was a mistake. And what shifts do you see in energy policy, and in particular the integration of energy security with the sustained effort to reduce man-made carbon emissions?
Yeah. I mean, the European Union has taken a clear engagement, which means we want to be carbon neutral in 2050. Because we have to be, because if we don't deliver that at that moment in time, how can we expect these efforts from the developing world? And if we are not delivering on this, it means that the temperature increase will just go into unsustainable areas, which would also lead to additional crises. If we are thinking, for example, about Africa, where already large parts nowadays are inhabitable. If those areas would increase, we can all imagine what would be the consequences. Of course, there are now effects from the Ukraine war, the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Personally, I expect mainly two. One is an acceleration of renewables. So we'll go more quickly into that direction. But I think also probably we will use more than originally expected coal, because there's less dependency on Russia. We know that coal is more polluting than gas. It's about double polluting as gas. But if we go forward more quickly on renewables, that's kind of compensated. So I would expect renewables to be accelerated, the introduction, coal coming in. Some member states might also re-evaluate the use of nuclear. The choice of your energy resource is in the sovereign right of the member states. So that's absolutely possible that that's going to happen. But it will not derail us from the aim to be carbon neutral in 2050. There will be a short-term adaptation to make us more independent. And even a country like Germany, which is quite dependent on Russian gas right now, has said ready to phase out coal immediately, ready to phase out oil before the end of this year, ready to phase out Russian gas in the next roughly 2 years. And that's a long-term decision with long-term effects on Russia. Once you've done that, there's no way back. And therefore, I believe that the consequences for Russia of this aggression will last for long beyond the current aggression, beyond the current war. They cannot be easily reversed. And anyhow, the trust is broken. And to change their energy delivery to Russia will be extremely costly because the pipelines are not there from northern Russia, from the northern Siberia, where are the fields for the Europeans. And also, you are not in a very good bargaining position if you've basically one customer left, and that customer is called China. So it might be that they have to sell below the cost it costs them themselves to get access to oil and gas. So that means that the times of profitable use of oil and gas for Russia might be over.
I think there are two recent experiences that are instructive. I think in the US, it's clear that the largest ever reduction in man-made carbon emissions occurred with the availability of cheap natural gas from fracking, from shale oil. And also, I think we should learn from the experience of Germany, which took this leap, right? This leap away from hydrocarbons it hoped, but certainly away from nuclear, and kind of leapt off a cliff a little bit in terms of energy security. What do you think about natural gas as a bridge? And I know the EU's been talking more and more about it. You mentioned it, but nuclear should play a very big role, especially next generation nuclear. Because next generation nuclear is also important to accessing hydrogen as an energy source in the long term. Is there some rethinking about natural gas as a bridge away from coal? Because as you mentioned, we're burning more coal now at the rate, each one of these plants burns a ton of coal every minute. And is there rethinking about the overall strategy with maybe more of an emphasis on natural gas and shale oil? Right. We know the Russians actually have paid quite a bit of money to environmental groups to lobby against shale oil and to perpetuate dependence on Russia broadly. What are the prospects of a big shift in energy policy in Europe?
As I said, the choice of the origin of your energy consumption, that's the national sovereignty. We see already that definitely France is going to invest heavily into new kind of nuclear generation with smaller power plants. Gas traditionally inside the European Union, a lot came from the Netherlands. They had problems because they're very densely populated, and over time this led to artificial earthquakes. But I understand they are ready to continue for a little while to ease the current stress in the market. Beyond that, there are huge reserves of shale gas, according at least to my information, in France, in Poland, and also in Northern Europe. And I believe that probably they will have a very close look at two things. A, production costs, which have very much decreased in last years, in the last 5 years, as we have seen in the United States. But secondly, in the public debate, the environmental impact is absolutely crucial. So there was also progress there. So I believe that many people will have a closer look at this again and see, does the progress justify to have a fresh look? There were these debates about 10 years ago. There, the answer was negative. Environmental arguments, I think, will be crucial. But it's also clear if we look, for example, at the Gulf, we see that this is an area full of tensions, and a lot of our dependence is also there. For the moment, Iran and Saudi Arabia have decided to have their war in Yemen. But if they ever should decide to go into more direct confrontation, that could have disastrous consequences also for European energy security. So therefore, I believe that there is a strong argument to find the energy closer to home, which brings Northern Africa into play. Italy has already made an agreement with Algeria about a substantial increase of gas that's coming from Algeria. In principle, Northern Africa would also be fantastic for solar energy. It needs a little bit more stability and also cooperation among North African countries to make this really happen. But huge potential over there. It would help the development of the Northern African countries, which would also be good for the stability in Europe. So there is a lot of potential out there for alternatives. And I'm sure that all of them will be freshly evaluated now.
Klaus, you've made the statement that the nations today face a choice, really, between empire or a community of law. And what, of course, you're alluding to is the competition, especially with two revanchist, revisionist, authoritarian powers on the Eurasian landmass, Russia and China. And our last conversation focused on the competition with China, and we touched a bit on the economic dimension of it as well. I think it's related to the discussion we've been having about energy security, because supply chains, as we know, have become quite fragile based on a bias toward efficiency rather than resilience. And in the area of rare earths and other minerals that are critical to the transition to renewable sources of energy, China is trying to get a lock on those supply chains. Now, I wonder what your observations are about the nature of the relationship between Russia and China, the danger that poses, and what more the citizens in our nations, our individual countries, and the EU have to do to compete more effectively with these authoritarian powers from a defense perspective, maybe, but really especially from an economic perspective.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, maybe let me first make that argument again. When you look at Europe, you basically see Western Europe and Central Europe, which is more or less covered by the European Union. And then you see Eastern Europe with Russia. And indeed, I believe that these are the two fundamental choices that countries have. How do they want to live? In Russia, you still have the continuity of thinking in terms of empire, not to say colonialization in their immediate neighborhood, which you can see in how they treat their neighbors and how they disrespect human rights. In Western Europe and in Central Europe, you can see that states are protected by being members of the European Union. It's a rule of law, it's a relationship of equal. Of course, there are smaller and bigger member states, that's sure, but everybody's sovereignty is respected and it's run on the basis of the rule of law. And the space between that is getting extremely thin. You are seeing that neutrality nowadays doesn't make any sense anymore. How can you be neutral between these two choices? So that's what's sponsoring the debate in Finland and in Sweden, and we're going to see the outcome probably already in May. But that's also why Moldova and Georgia are now rushing together with Ukraine to say we would like to become members of the European Union, because we know that our statehood is being respected, even though, of course, it means we have to make compromise. So basically, there is just these two which are available, and they are fundamentally different. That's the difference between the 19th century and the 21st century. The question is also, why are these autocracies? And I think there are autocracies because probably the way they are running their countries is otherwise not sustainable. That's surely the case for Russia, but probably also the case for China, where there are enormous internal tensions between people in Tibet, the Uyghurs, but even between the coastal provinces and the others. So the question is, how would this all play out under democratic conditions as we know them? Probably it would be very difficult. So I believe, in fact, the Russian problem is exactly that their model cannot compete. Their model is not competitive. For the Ukrainians, it's not attractive to join that kind of running a country. It's attractive, and that sponsored the whole difficulty in 2014 to do an association agreement with the European Union. The Ukrainians decided in 2014, in fact, to topple their government because they were not ready to lose the perspective of integration into the European Union. That's sometimes forgotten, but they know what this means and they've made their choice. And therefore, the Russian offer and the Russian model is not competitive in the greater order of things.
I think that you make a really important point here. Oftentimes we hear, I don't know what to call them except Russian apologists who blame us for Russia's aggression. But I think it's quite clear based on the invasion of Ukraine, certainly the invasion of Ukraine, the first one in 2014, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, now the occupation of Belarus that we're seeing now, the threat to Moldova and these false flag apparently operations in Transnistria, that Putin actually has aspirations that go far beyond what he does in reaction to us. And it's encouraging to hear you making the case really for EU enlargement. What do you think the prospects are of the EU welcoming those countries into the Union in the near future?
Mm-hmm. I think the honest answer is that definitely it takes time, but it can go more quickly than it would have gone otherwise. Because the motivation, I think also in those countries now is enormous to do the necessary adaptations. And sometimes this is tough. I've been working very closely already as Secretary General of this House with former Prime Minister Jerzy Buzek, who was President of the European Parliament. And he was heading the Polish government in the early 90s. And that's when they did the major reforms of social security. And once his government was finished, not only did his party not continue in government, but it wasn't going back into parliament. That's severe were the efforts they had to do. So it's very tough. It's very tough to reform and restructure your country. But if the goal is there, that's sufficiently attractive, you might be ready to do it. And I think that will now make all the difference for Ukraine, but definitely also for Moldova. Otherwise, I would be very surprised. So things could happen much more quickly. And I believe also that a lot of support will be available on the way.
So during our conversation in November of 2021, we were discussing the EU's response to the competition with an increasingly aggressive Chinese Communist Party. And I think what we've seen with Russia is how maybe many businesses and financial institutions undervalued the geostrategic risk of doing business in and investing in an authoritarian country. Of course, even during the war with Ukraine, which the renewed war that began on February 24th, China's become even more aggressive in its wolf warrior diplomacy and in helping amplify Russian disinformation. It's continued its cyber espionage and hacking activities. It's engaged in a campaign of economic coercion against Lithuania. And so what is your prescription? What more do you think the EU should do and the EU and the United States and the free world should do to reduce the risk associated with the Chinese Communist Party and a potential maybe rending of the economic relationships if there's a crisis in Taiwan, for example?
Yeah. I personally believe that China is now looking very, very carefully on how Russia-Ukraine is playing out, because to a certain extent that could establish a playbook for the future. And therefore, I think the strong Western reaction was very, very important and is very, very important, and that this is not a success. Of course, we know that China has developed over the decades. I had the privilege, or have the privilege, to have been able to meet in the past years once a year with Henry Kissinger, who played a crucial role in opening up China, and which started these decades of fantastic economic development, which brought hundreds of millions out of poverty. And at a personal experience in 2001, I was allowed to speak to the staff of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China in Dalian. And I was surprised because it was a very open debate. Young people were allowed to take the floor. There were different views. And that explained to me to a certain extent, where did the creativity come from in the system that allowed for this economic development? Unfortunately, nowadays, we must have the impression that this freedom, which at least existed within the Communist Party, has been very, very much reduced. and also the collective leadership, which was probably one of the preconditions for the success of China, is now being replaced more and more by one person who is now probably going to be allowed to have more than 2 mandates this time. So that's putting some more question marks, even from a Chinese perspective, behind their development. Of course, China, without announcing officially, blocked out Lithuania from trade with China. And the European Union has defended Lithuania from the very beginning. It attacked China in the World Trade Organization. And also it supports that Lithuania is supporting its companies with state aid to balance out the negative effects that can come from, let's say, from this Chinese behavior. And the European Commission is also looking for legislative approval of anti-coercion measures. So when an individual country of the European Union is threatened by a third party, like in this case Lithuania, that the European Union as a whole can take sanctions against that country. That's in the legislative process. And therefore, I think the European Union is about to take, let's say, conclusions which give it the necessary weapons to deal with these kind of situations.
Klaus, you've been a champion of democracy your whole life. And of course, democracy is messy and ugly in your own country. And my second country, which I lived for over 6 years in Germany, just had a very highly contested election and a new coalition government. We just saw the very, I mean, not a close election in France, but a very vitriolic campaign on both the part of President Macron and Marine Le Pen, who represents a far right party. You mentioned Brexit but I mean, democracy does have a mechanism for correction short of revolution. I wonder if you might just share with us your prospects for democracy, how you see our democracies. Of course, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin thought we were very weak, as we already discussed at the outset. I'm thinking about the joint statement they issued just before the Beijing Olympics, in which the message to us was, hey, Europe and the United States and Japan and other free and open and democratic societies, you're over, you're finished, right? This is a new era of international relations in which we're in charge, essentially, was the message. But I'm more hopeful, I'm more confident. I would love to hear your thoughts on the prospects for democratic governance.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we are challenged by authoritarian, if not totalitarian regimes, roughly for the last 100 years, starting with the Russian Revolution, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. What's the advantage for us Germans is that we've been resoundingly defeated in World War II. So we could correct. We could firmly anchor ourselves into the democratic community international. The problem on the Russian side is that they were victorious at the end of the day, even though they started the same war in September 1939, with a difference of only 3 weeks and half Poland between Germany and Russia. So in Russia, there is a continuity, and that hasn't really stopped, to see positively the activities in the past, including the Stalin time, the Great War and the Second World War. So it hasn't profited from this break and this critical reflection of its own imperial past. That is the advantage for us Germans, because we've lost it so convincingly in 1945. So we also know that in the critical moments, it was the United States that saved us, surely in the Second World War, but also against Soviet dominance during the Cold War up to 1989 and 1991. And also the United States had learned the lesson that it better remains engaged, because if it's not, it maybe has to come back, and the price it's going to pay in money and blood is much higher. So we have to keep that lesson alive, that the democratic states are cooperating very closely. It's true that we are also all challenged, and I also can say the 6th of January was not a beautiful sight on Capitol, and at least I would have never believed that we could come so close to democracy in the United States being challenged, and we have also issues in different European Union countries. I've always tried to invest into this relationship. I'm now in office for 13 years. One of my first measures was to establish an office of the European Parliament in Washington, D.C. We have 12 staffers there. I have a regular meeting with the clerk of the House, the secretary of the Senate. We discuss during difficult times. We just have a video conference, so we try to live this transatlantic relationship and to strengthen each other mutually. I'm deeply convinced that with all difficulties, as you say, democratic systems have the chance to correct. In autocratic systems, you can be the folly of a single person, and you might have to pay dearly for that. So I believe with all difficulties, we are also aware of that at the end of the day, democracy will prevail. And we see that we used the opportunity after 1989, 1991, to enlarge the democratic space 1,000 or maybe more than 1,000 kilometers to the east. That's what's now, let's say, under threat. But we enlarged it heavily to the east. So we made use of that opportunity and we enlarged the space of democracy. So no reason to be skeptical, no reason to be pessimistic. But like always, we will have to fight for our freedom.
Klaus, I do think it's time for us to restore our confidence, and maybe reflecting back to 1989 to 1991 helps us do that a bit. Of course, this is what the people in those countries wanted, is they wanted freedom. They wanted a say in how they're governed. And I had the great privilege, Klaus, I think I've told you this before, of being in the regiment that patrolled the East-West German border, centered on Coburg, and our troopers, the troop that I would command later, was patrolling that border in November of 1989, when we went from one moment staring down East German border guards to the next moment seeing tens and then hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of East Germans streaming across that border bearing bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine. And of course, there were hugs and tears of joy. And I think we need to restore a bit of that confidence these days. And can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing to restore confidence in democratic institutions and what your prognosis is for the future of democracy in other places as well? I mean, I think we've all been a little bit disappointed in how India's responded to the invasion of Ukraine, but do you think it's time for us now? Have we bottomed out in terms of our self-doubt about democratic institutions and processes?
The European Parliament has a very long tradition to fight for human rights and democracy. We have a Sakharov Prize, which is named after Andrei Sakharov, with the agreement of his widow, Yelena Bona, which we give every year to people who stand out there, like the Belarusian opposition or others who are fighting for freedom. But we are also doing practical help. That's why Ukraine for us is not really coming as something sudden or as a surprise. We are supporting Ukrainian democracy for more than 10 years. We have been supporting when democratic leaders were jailed by the former president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, sending delegations there, making sure that they were not mistreated. And we've also been bringing together the different political parties in Ukraine. In fact, in the house of Jean Monnet, one of our founders close to Paris, and said, look, these are majority rights, but please also think about minority rights. Democracy is not just about the 51%, it's also about the 49, the 30, the 15, the 10%, and their rights also have to be respected. We are doing similar activities with Balkan countries, with North Africans, if they are interested. In fact, we have a whole directorate in Parliament administration on democracy promotion. So we are doing that. We are internationally engaged. The European Parliament has delegations around the world. We are passing human rights resolution every single session. That means that sometimes we are not very happy with all the let's say governments are not very happy with us around the world, but the democratic opposition is, and the human rights activists are, and they know they have a solid voice in the European Parliament, and we are with them, because the rights we enjoy, we want that also other people can enjoy.
Klaus, you really already answered this question, because you've addressed this tension between the need for multinational coordination and cooperation within international organizations like the European Union, and sometimes there's a tension with sovereignty, and of course that's been a big theme within the EU in recent years, and it's what has led to a great deal of skepticism in the United States recently about international organizations. Of course, the Secretary General of the UN has just visited Russia and Ukraine, but the UN doesn't seem to be quite strong because of the ability of Russia and China to obstruct within the Security Council, for example. International organizations have been deliberately subverted, right, by those who have other agendas, of the World Health Organization and China, or the Human Rights Council. Could you maybe help explain to Americans just the overall value of international organizations, what they can achieve? You mentioned quite a bit about it already, but I think sometimes the EU gets judged by an unfair standard. I think as a historian, I think back to 1945 and say the outlook in 1945 was not great. And actually, the European Union has probably far exceeded expectations that anyone would have had in the wake of World War II. So maybe for the skeptical Americans, could you explain the importance of organizations like the EU and why Americans should care about them and see the benefit?
Yeah. Look, our argument is that, in fact, a pooling sovereignty in the European Union is making individual member states more sovereign and not less. What Russia would like is to be able to deal with everybody separately, and then they would be weak. And we know from our historical past that very often weaker states were even swallowed. That's exactly what happened between World War I and World War II with all the smaller states that were created between Germany and Russia. So in fact, the European Union is the guarantee for the continued existence of all its member states, for its protection, for the rule of law. And together we are stronger. We have a market of 440 million citizens. We are arguably maybe one of the strongest, if not the strongest, regulatory power around the world, at least in times where the US Congress can't agree among themselves. You see, gives us a bit of competitive advantage. So we are strong. We are strong in these fields. We are one of the biggest donors in development aid as well. But basically, the member states do what they do. But if they find out that they can't do it on their own anymore, they pool that sovereignty on the European Union level, and then together we are strong. So we are in a process of slow growth. We've been established by sovereign states, but so has the United States of America. It's nowadays forgotten, but there were 13 sovereign states which came to the conclusion that their interests are better defended to create the United States of America, which is why we have the United States in the plural and not a state, the United States of America. And our history is a bit similar. I'm not saying the outcome will be the same, but it's sovereign states who have freely decided that their interests are better served together. And we have the European Parliament representing the citizens elected in direct elections, 440 million people, one of the biggest elections around the world. We have the Council of Ministers representing the state, a bit like your Senate. And only when these two together are coming together, we are passing laws. And our Commission is a bit like your administration. And our European Council is a bit like a kind of collective presidency, not an imperial presidency, but nevertheless a body capable to take decisions in times of stress. So I would argue that the European Union is helping to make its member states more sovereign, more solid, more capable to act, more able to defend itself. And we see in times of crisis, also for the United States, it's much better to have one solid partner than to have to deal with 27 different entities.
Klaus, thank you so much. I think that really places the European Union in context. And what I'd like to do is just give you the final word. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers and our listeners?
No, I would just like to thank you for this unique opportunity. I'm really a big believer in that relationship between the European Union, Europe, and the United States, because if these two continental democracies are coming together and are maybe convincing other continental democracies like India or the Japanese or the others to join, I think we do not have to be afraid about the future. And let me also say that Stanford is a great place where you are. I once had the privilege to spend there 2 weeks, and I really enjoyed that very, very much. I'm looking forward to come back one day.
Klaus Welle, on behalf of the Hoover Institution and Stanford University, thank you for helping us learn more about how we can work together to restore peace, promote prosperity, build confidence in our democracies, and build a better future for generations to come. Pleasure to see you.
My pleasure.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.